Join me today while I talk about how I set my Olympus cameras up for exposure. Hey, thanks for joining me. Today I want to talk about some of the settings I use in my cameras, mainly about how I set these up for exposure. Now, today it seems like in certain ways we really embrace the technology that modern cameras have. I mean, I don't think anyone today rejects autofocus as a wonderful tool. And though there are times when we do manually focus, predominantly we'll let the camera do the autofocus. And it does it very quickly and does it very precisely. But there seems to be this trend that people want to set their cameras completely manually when it comes to exposure. I mean, they read what the meter says, they look at the exposure setting, that the camera is recommending, but they want to control it all manually. And to me that seems a little bit, I don't know, like a waste of the technology. Today's cameras have some really amazing metering systems and the ability to, really give us some tools to not only be able to get accurate exposures, but to do it quickly. So often when I'm shooting, I use these cameras in aperture priority. That seems to be the way that works best for me. Largely, I don't shoot a lot of sports. If I was shooting sports, I might use shutter priority. But the things I shoot, typically they're not moving that fast. I'll tend to use the aperture priority, set the aperture to get the kind of depth of field that I want, whether that's a lot of depth of field or maybe a little if I want, the out of focus backgrounds, and then let the camera set the shutter speed. But I actually take that one step further in that I actually set my cameras to auto ISO, so the camera's automatically selecting a speed, an ISO setting. Now, the reason I do that is that it gives me some flexibility. I keep an eye on it. It's not like I ignore it and don't even look to see what ISO it's choosing, but this gives me some flexibility. If I decide to switch to manual mode because I want to use a specific shutter speed and I also want to use a specific aperture, then the ISO allows me to do that and not miss a shot if the light changes suddenly, or there's some quick change like that. So I have found that the auto ISO setting is a really valuable tool. Now there are times when I'll turn it off. If I absolutely want to use the lowest ISO setting I can, but then I have to make compensations in terms of either shutter speed or aperture, to get the lighting right. But I think today's cameras have a lot of really amazing features when it comes to exposure, and to reject all that and just set the camera manually. I mean, I know you're still using the meter in the camera, but it just seems like kind of a rejection of the technology. I mean, we don't do that with focus. We don't go around saying I can focus better than the autofocus and do it faster. Of course not. And the autofocus in these cameras today are amazing. But so is the exposure capability of these cameras. So I think using these controls and not getting stuck in one way and saying I'm only going to shoot manual, all manual, or I'm only going to shoot in whatever other mode. So, I generally speaking use aperture priority. There are times I might switch to shutter priority if there's something like if I'm photographing one of my grandkids' baseball games or something like that. But largely I'm going to shoot in aperture priority with auto ISO. So let's take a look at the settings in this camera and show you how they set them. Setting the controls on an Olympus camera is really quite easy. I can access the Super Control panel by pressing the OK button, and then I can control any number of settings on the Super Control panel. Here I want to change the ISO, so I can choose that. Now it's currently set to auto, which, as I was mentioning, is where I like it. But if I need to set a specific ISO, I can. Or I can go back to auto and select that. On the top of the camera, I've got my control here for aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual. So whatever shooting mode I want to use, I can select there. And then of course I have controls on the rear and on the front. This camera is set up so the rear one controls my aperture. I can change what aperture the camera's using, and the front one is exposure compensation. So if I dial in, I can make the image lighter or darker. One of the really great things about the mirrorless cameras, of course, is that you can actually see what the results are going to look like before you take the picture. So that's how I generally set my cameras up. I have a variety of these Olympus cameras. I think I have 3 or 4 different ones, but I typically use them pretty much the same way. You know, if a situation demands some other setting, then of course I do that. Every now and then I'll find that I need to switch to manual to get the control I need to get the results I want. But largely I'm able to use those settings and adjust things just the way I need. Now, one thing to keep in mind is with the Olympus cameras, and I'm sure you can do this with just about everyone else's, is I can also do an exposure compensation, either over or under compensate. In other words, reduce or increase the exposure. And being that these are mirrorless cameras, I'm seeing the image in live view. So it's, you know, I'm actually seeing the image as it will look after the exposure is done on the display or in the viewfinder. So I can use exposure compensation if I decide that the camera is maybe seeing things a little differently than I am, and I want to increase or decrease the exposure. I can easily just, you know, on this camera you've got a thumb control on the front and the back. It's the one on the back I can control the aperture, one on the front I can control the exposure compensation, and I can, you know, I can lighten or darken the scene as need be and see the results on the viewfinder or the display as I'm doing it, since it's in live view. It's one of the advantages of a mirrorless camera over a DSLR, where you're actually looking at the digital image that's going to be recorded, and the live view allows you to see the exposure as it's going to look when you take the picture. So I don't know, it's a really versatile setup. I really enjoyed using it, and for me this is you know, what seems to work best. So if you have other ways that you do your camera, I'd love to hear about how you set your camera up. But I think it's important not to get the idea that if you don't shoot everything in manual, that somehow you're just not a real photographer, or that you're just a rank amateur if you don't use manual mode. I think that's wrong, and I think it's just a rejection of the technology. There's so much technology here, and we embrace a lot of it. You know, the digital imaging, the autofocus, you know, all the other features that the camera has, and then somehow, you know, we want to kind of reject what it does in terms of exposure. And I haven't ever quite understood that. You know, especially if you're going to set the camera to more or less what the meter says, why not let the camera set it? It can do it much quicker and faster, and in smaller increments than you know, generally speaking, when you're setting, say, apertures or shutter speeds, you're choosing increments, 1 stop or half stop, 3rd stop, you know, whatever those increments are. But when the camera does exposure, it can choose finer increments. So, you know, letting the camera do the work that it was designed to do in terms of exposure, I think is really beneficial. If you're going to, you know, pay for all the technology that these cameras have, you should take advantage of it. So anyway, that's how I like to set these up. Well, thanks for joining me today. I always appreciate it when you watch my videos. If you would, please click the like and subscribe buttons. That'll help the channel grow. And as always, thanks for watching.